Thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many people here. I mean, apart from anything else, and wherever we go this afternoon, I do think we are at one of those liminal and shifting points in our collective story, which perhaps is to do with moving towards a final participation, having some sense in which we can perceive and articulate meaning in a new way, rather than just tabulating and listing things, interesting as that is. So I want to go back to what Mark and Gary were talking about earlier. I think a key word, we had some very good things from Gary about that. The key word is imagination. And the key idea I think we need to get at from then, and perhaps to bring forward, is that although we can speak of the imaginary in the sense of the purely made up, we would be making a big mistake if we thought that all the imagination did was what Coleridge called fancy, or fancy generating these non-real compensatory little pictures. I thought there was a definition of the imagination by Coleridge, which was hugely important to Owen Barfield, that would be really pertinent to this. So if I can just bring that forward to begin with. So this is actually, to use the language of my generation, a mind-blowing definition. So this is what Coleridge said famously in the Biographia Literaria, a book he wrote a bit later in his life, when he was looking back on the experience of having had this extraordinary imaginative flowering a decade earlier. So, 2 decades earlier. So this is what he says. He says, imagination, the primary imagination as he calls it, and these are his words, is the living power and prime agent of all perception. All perception. So first of all, he's saying you don't see, which you were talking about, he's saying you don't see anything if your imagination hasn't already brought to the table and begun to make connections and links and cohere and do something with the sheer torrent of data that may be coming to you through your senses. That has to be, something inside you has to see the shapes and the possibilities and the wholes. And it can scarcely make or form, and it's an active power, living power, and prime agent of perception. In the very act of forming out of the flow of, if you like, bits and bytes, the picture of the world as you have it, it's also both perceiving meaning in it and clothing it with meaning. Because we are the heart of who we are dwells in meaning and the possibility of meaning, which is why it's so interesting, Simon, when you said there's all this stuff, but it hasn't got meaning. Meaning, metaphor, and imagination are all linked together. So Coleridge says imagination is the living power and prime agent of all perception. That's interesting in itself. But then he goes on to say this, immediately after that, in the same sentence, he says, it is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Extraordinary thing to say. Every act of perception that we have, the act of perception that we're all doing right now, particularly, I would say, the extraordinary act of perceiving human faces, and in faces and eyes perceiving a connectedness and a reservoir of meaning and relationship and possibility, and realizing that the face in front of us is actually more significant than the chair they're sitting on, or the other configurations of light and shade that make up this room. He says, Coleridge is saying, when you perceive with the power of the imagination, you are experiencing in your inside self a repetition of what he calls the infinite I am, of an eternal act of creation. As it were, God is, for Coleridge, creation isn't a thing that happened at a chronological point, because he didn't make the world in time, as though time were already there, but with time. So from Coleridge's point of view, if we're to think of a God who creates, that God is absolutely present, and that creation is happening freshly right now. And even as it happens, you're perceiving it with him. And one of the analogies that Coleridge liked to use, again, is an analogy of language, that you can have you can take all the bits and pieces of the world and you can find out a great deal about them, but unless you understand that they're saying something, you've not understood what they are. So just to take an obvious example, I've got, and I'm going to work close with them, there's a couple of poems of mine on the pieces of paper in front of you. Now, we could do a wonderful job on analysing what you have on this paper by analysing the chemistry of the paper itself. We could do a fantastic geometrical assessment of the letters and a statistical account of where they all were. And we could accumulate a vast body of absolutely correct knowledge and data about what's there. Until one day somebody said, "Did you know it's a poem?" Really? What's that? Suddenly we would, if we then discovered that it could be read, that it said something, that this set of data was coming from one mind to another, and that this stuff was transfigured in its meaning, or through meaning, and becomes something else, we'd be astonished. Now, to have that astonishing wake-up to that would not in any sense invalidate, eradicate, or any of the other things we knew about the physicality of the poem. Coleridge once wrote, who's thinking about how his child should grow up. It's in the famous poem Frost at Midnight. And he describes the lakes and sandy shores and the crags of ancient mountains. And then he says, "My child shall wander like a breeze," you know, going through these. And then he says this about his child growing up, looking at the mountains and reflected in the lakes and the clouds reflecting the shape, all these series of echoes and reflections. Coleridge says this: "So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit and by giving make it ask." So these things have suddenly become a medium of exchange between consciousnesses. So to cut a long story short, Coleridge, having left the faith in which he was brought up and having tried many other ranges and realms of ideas and philosophies, became very struck that I-amness was a key to the whole thing. The nature of consciousness, the relationship of consciousness to what's out there. He famously said, "There are really only two statements with which you can begin your account of reality. You either have got to say, 'it is,' and start with the actual thingitude of things and then see if you can arrive at 'I am,' and he didn't think that was going to be possible. But you could start with 'I am' and see if you can arrive at 'it is,' which you can, but the 'it that is' turns out to be not dead stuff at all, but living, flowing symbol and language. So Coleridge became very interested in the idea that the name Yahweh in the Old Testament means I am. The other thing he thought, which I think is very significant to this discussion, is that the way we've all been brought up with this kind of binary dualism between matter and spirit, which I know you were railing against, you know, people using words like mechanical or material in a contemptuous or dismissive way. We were brought up with this because we were told there was an absolute split between subjective knowledge and objective knowledge. That the subject is always privately islanded in here and doesn't really mean anything or impact anything or isn't really real. But the dry stuff out there, which is quantity but not quality, that's the real stuff. And we kind of know that can't be right. But that's the way we've been brought up. It's a kind of epistemological apartheid, do you know what I mean? This is the main economy of stuff, and then you can have your artistic feelings and a little separate development sort of Bantustan over here, but it doesn't get to count as reality. We were all taught that. Coleridge makes the blindingly obvious point that when you say I am, your two supposedly distinct worlds of subject and object are the same thing. The I who says I am is clearly the subject and is subjectively feeling conscious, I am. But what is the object of that consciousness? Well, it's the same I. That's what consciousness means. These opposite things come together, and out of their coming together, something else flows. So I loved Coleridge's poetry, and I felt it was telling me something transformative from when I was quite young. But it was only when following the Inklings and getting deeply into the Inklings that I picked up Owen Barfield's late book, What Coleridge Thought, that I suddenly realized how profound and how profoundly relevant Coleridge's thinking was. And then I got in more deeply into Barfield because of that. And in various places, we had a nice Owen Barfield reading group in Cambridge for a while, I discovered that wherever you were saying about a study, about a relationship between science and value, I mean, and you were saying, I wish I could bring those two things into conversation with each other, you discovered that Owen Barfield had already done it. And therefore he was an interesting, and stimulating person for thought to follow. I've probably gone on longer than I should. I wonder if I might read to you the two poems that I sort of picked, and which have kindly been printed here. One is just my big thank you to Coleridge, and it expresses some of this sense of what Coleridge's I amness is. But the other is my meditation on that very, very curious saying of Jesus amongst the I am sayings, as they're called. In the Greek of the New Testament, he doesn't say ego, which is sufficient for I am. He says ego eimi, and it's a kind of link back to that word. The other is a meditation on that very odd saying of Jesus, when they're taunting him for saying, you're not yet 40 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And he says, before Abraham was, I am. And if you realize, if you read the text in context, they pick up stones to stone him because he said that. So either they were really extreme grammar nerds, I'm sorry, there's a confusion of tenses, I'll have to kill you. But, or they knew that he was speaking the name of God. And he was breathing that name into being in himself. And that was either astonishingly revolutionary and consciousness from out there coming in here and flowing out again, or he was a blasphemer. So I'll read you the Coleridge one first. So this is Coleridge's epitaph that he composed himself, starts with the words, stop Christian passerby, stop child of God. It's really disturbing when you see it. It's like the ancient mariner suddenly put his finger in and says, yes, stop. So here we are. Stop Christian passerby, stop child of God. You made your epitaph imperative and stopped this wedding guest. But I'm glad to stop with you and start again, to live from that pure source, the all-renewing stream whose living power is imagination, and know myself a child of the I am, open and loving to his whole creation. Your glittering eye taught mine to pierce the veil, to let his light transfigure all my seeing, to serve the shaping spirit whom I feel, and make with him the poem of my being. I follow where you sail towards our haven, your wide wake lit with glimmerings of heaven. And then just returning to this sense of the source of I am, Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. How Coleridge understood that, and I understand it too, is that we can each of us only say I am and have this wonderful consciousness because our I amness is gifted by this great I am. And the joy of perceiving our being arises when, as it were, the universe as we perceive it shimmers into being between our little I am and that great I am, and we enjoy it together. The great I am imaginatively creating it, and our I am imaginatively reading it. You can't, if you like a poem, you're at least as good as you think the poet is that you're reading. Because the poet's just given you the starter kit, hasn't it? The poet's just poured a bunch of ingredients into your head, and your imagination actively makes it. Anyway, here's my take on Jesus as saying that. Before Abraham was, I am. Oh, pure I am, the source of everything, the wellspring of my inner consciousness, the song within the songs I find to sing, the bliss of being and the crown of bliss. You iterate and indwell all the instants wherein I wake and wonder that I am, as every moment of my own existence runs over from the fountain of your name. I turn with Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, with everyone whom you have called to be. I turn with all the fallen race of Adam to hear you calling, calling, come to me. With them I come, all weary and oppressed, and lay my labors at your feet and rest.